Okay, this is basically the answer to a question that I've been asked. A lot of people, when they set up CO2, they set up like their little diffuser, and then they say, my bubbles are going up and they're just like popping at the surface. It's not going everywhere where it needs to go. So that's a very good question. So CO2, when given to a tank, also should dissipate, but it should have enough time in the water to dissolve so that it's available to plants. So you really don't want your bubbles popping at the top of the surface. So there are several ways of how you can maximize your CO2. One, it will save you CO2, and secondly, if you're not doing it right, you're just basically wasting CO2, which is not becoming available to plants. Now, it's not so critical how you're diffusing your CO2 when you're growing just like your average plants. Like, this tank, I have some crypts in the bottom. I have, I really didn't escape it. I just kind of threw all the plants that I didn't find a place for. I have a Madagascar lace, crinum, a bunch of crypts. So the diffusion is not as critical as if you, for example, if you grow a carpet on the bottom, you want to make sure that those bubbles and get dissolved and they hit the bottom. So again, there's several ways. So as I said, in this tank is not as critical, but in this case, I put my diffuser under the lily pipe. So as the bubbles go up, some of them get pushed by this flow, get dissolved, and the tank has been usually fine. These plants don't require high levels of CO2. But if you are growing plants that are dependent on CO2 and will die if they don't get it, then there's several places you can place your diffuser. So let me show you another example. Okay, please excuse my tape. I have a 24-inch light over a 36-inch tank. So these plants in the front are not getting enough light. So I just pull the light a little bit forward. I am putting a 36-inch light, which will have more power and it will be sufficient for this tank. This is just temporary. But I just wanted to show you one thing. Like, some people don't really like the look of these bubbles, but if you have plants that are dependent and will die if they don't get enough CO2 here in the bottom. Let's say you have your diffuser, like, I don't know, here in the corner, and you get like your bubbles and they kind of like pop here. You're not getting enough in the water column so that CO2 level becomes high enough. You need to place your diffuser in what's called a downwash. So your tank has a flow, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes it will be on the opposite corner of your intake and outtake. So if your filter is strong enough, your intake and outtake, for example, in this tank, are on the right side, right here. They push the water forward this way, they hit this back wall, and that creates a downwash forward when it meets the diffuser. As a result, these bubbles are traveling this way, and if you look really carefully, they are touching the plants in the bottom that probably wouldn't make it if they don't get it. Okay, so this is like for the complicated plants. If you don't give them that and they live on the bottom, so it's the hardest place for the CO2 to reach, then you may have CO2 and you may still not be able to grow some plants. And you are like, oh my gosh, what am I doing wrong? I have CO2, I have light, why are they not growing? Why are they dying? That could be the reason. Now, if you don't like the look of these bubbles, and many people don't, there are several ways you can diffuse without having a diffuser in your tank. Now, this is the most affordable option. This is the option I like. And I have tried an inline diffuser. So what an inline diffuser would be is, instead of having this apparatus coming into your tank, there is like a little thing you buy and you put it on your hose on the outtake. Basically, you just cut your outtake, which I don't have one to show you because the one I had, I sold it. It's a pretty good thing. At the time I sold it is because I didn't have enough height for, I had like a inline heater and then inline diffuser, and it was too complicated. I cut my hose like in two places, and I don't like to disrupt my hose from the canister, because the more things you add on your canister hose, the more you're impeding that flow. You may not have as much flow if you're like adding things inline. So what that means, anything you add inline, so this is the out from the canister, you would cut this hose and you can put like an inline diffuser. So then you know, it's basically the same thing. It's like a little device like this big, and then you connect your CO2 straight into it, like your tubing from CO2, like this little guy goes straight into your inline, and it diffuses it through the hose. So by the time you get like your outtake, by the time the water comes into your tank, the CO2 had enough time to diffuse. So that's one option. And another option is you can also do like a CO2 reactor, which is basically kind of the same thing as an inline diffuser, but the reactor requires a little bit stronger filter to push the water through. And it is basically the same thing. You would cut your hose, you would put your inline reactor there, and then you would connect, the same way as inline diffuser, you would connect your CO2 to it, and then the water would go into your reactor. It would kind of travel through the reactor, it would dissolve through the hose, and by the time it comes out, your water is saturated with CO2. The benefit of a CO2 reactor is that you wouldn't see these bubbles, and that's one of the most common reasons why people go to a CO2 reactor instead of a CO2 diffuser. So, I don't think it's a bad thing. I just kind of like to visually see what's going on in my tank, how much I'm diffusing. But some people don't like that. They like that CO2 to be kind of invisible, already diluted in the water. And I've had that. It didn't work for me. I sold my inline diffuser, and I just used kind of like the old-fashioned method. Now, one more thing you can do to control your CO2, there are two ways to know how much you have. You can use a liquid. You can use like this little liquid that changes colors depending on, basically it measures pH, essentially what it does. But it has three colors. Blue is like not enough CO2. Green is you have just right amount, and when the solution turns yellow, that means you have too much and you may kill your fish. So you're looking kind of at the green range, you're probably good. Your pH is in the range, it's not gonna really kill your fish. Now if you want to be even more advanced than the little, liquid changing color, this is really simple. You can do this like for $10. There are all kinds of little things you can hang off of your tank. You can, like that one is like round. There's like all kinds of shapes you can buy. Just put like 15 drops of a solution and it changes colors depending on how much CO2 you have. And that's like the easiest way, and I like that way. But if you are minimalist, you like your tank to be super clean, you don't want to like have anything in it, you can do a lot of these things behind the scenes. As I said, you can diffuse your CO2 via a reactor or an inline diffuser, and then you can also not have that if you use a pH monitor. pH monitors are pretty expensive. I would like to have one, but I don't have one. So basically they're kind of doing the same thing, but a little bit more accurately. You get a probe. A probe would be kind of like something like my finger, that you hide in your tank somewhere, and that kind of like, feels how much pH is in there. And basically you connect your solenoid, your CO2 solenoid, to the pH monitor. So if you say to your pH monitor, I want my pH to be 6.5, it's going to diffuse CO2 until it reaches 6.5. At that point, the solenoid will kick on and it will shut it off. And then let's say your pH again goes to 6.8, but you've programmed it to be 6.5. Any fluctuation, that pH monitor can help that pH really constant. Now that's a really nice thing to have. I would like to have one, but they're like over $100. And I don't own a pH monitor. A lot of people are putting their tanks on those pH monitors, and I have 10 tanks, so if I even put like 5 of them on pH monitors, I need like a $700 for that. So you don't need it, but I'm just saying that's like another way. So if you don't want your bubbles to be visible, you can diffuse them before they come into the tank. You can put a lot of stuff on your canister line. You can put the heater on it. You can put a diffuser on it. I don't like putting stuff on my line. I find that reduces flow. I kind of tend to forget about it, to clean it and stuff, to check on it. This way I know, like, oh, my diffuser is dirty, and I can just pull it out and put it in some bleach and, clean my stone. But when you have that stone in the hose, like it's like, a little device in your hose, and then you have like another point where things can leak and stuff. So I really don't like to be putting a lot of equipment on my intake and outtake. I just kind of like the old-fashioned method. So again, I apologize for the temporary. I pulled my light with some painter's tape forward just to kind of give a little bit more power to these plants until I'm getting a little bit stronger light, and things will look a lot better once I put like a new light on that's proper for this tank, because this is just kind of a temporary thing. But with a new setup, actually having a little lower light is good, because nothing is actively growing. When you just plant things, they're gathering their energy, they're getting adjusted, they're growing roots. So if you blast them right away with a high amount of light, you may immediately get algae. So if you have a new setup and you start with a little bit less light, that's kind of not a bad thing. So anyways, I just wanted to explain that about CO2. You do want to figure out how your water flows in your tank. You need to have enough flow, plants like flow. And then you put your diffuser on a downwash so that you see those bubbles moving through instead of up and popping at the surface. This will also save you how much CO2 you're diffusing, because if you can diffuse like 2 bubbles and get saturation level you need, then you don't need to be diffusing 7 bubbles to get the saturation you need in the water. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope that's helpful and answers your question about where to place your CO2 diffuser and how to get those bubbles to go down. Thanks for watching.